Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 25 cheat sheet. It's a game week with the double game week that, based on last week's episode, you must be surprised about if you've just been watching continuously as a series. The cheat sheet series is really just looking at how I rate FPL players based on, I would say, the next 3 to 8 fixtures. We now show 4 fixtures, which is great on the cheat sheet, but I take it a decade approach to this. So, and also understand that ultimately, when we're thinking 8 game weeks ahead, some people might have already wildcarded, and that's the kind of landscape we're in. So mostly placing the importance within the immediate fixtures leading up towards blank Game Week 29, and expecting that, of course, the importance of players does tend to fall off after Game Week 30, because that could be when you're already using your wildcard. So as far as the midfield cheat sheet, not too much has changed, because I'd say our importance placed over the Bournemouth midfielders has already been there. And they're now the priority transfers because they're secure for the blank in Game Week 29, and they're just astoundingly underpriced, despite multiple changes in price. Dango, I still really love. Kluivert as well. There's, of course, the news about his newborn child, which we can track, but all the players I think are great. If you ask me to rate how I evaluate the players now, I'd probably still go Dango, Kluivert, and then Semenyo, and I think they're still very, very close in between them. I'm sure some people will go for Kluivert. He was the player of the month. He's been the more informed player, of course. He's converted some great chances more recently. But Dango's position for me is still very much secure. I really do like a center forward, and at that price point, I think he's just amazing. Ranieri has been added to the cheat sheet in the sort of next tier of players. He's actually arguably someone who could be a green. But it's not like he, apart from the set pieces, is someone who's extremely productive in open play. He clearly has, I would say, a very, very skilled arsenal for that sort of young level of player. That sort of left foot finesse is very, very obvious. And outside of that, though, I'd say when you compare to some of the other more established midfielders, the production probably will take and lag a bit. And his minutes will be really good because of the unfortunate Arsenal injury. So yes, the fixtures are great for Arsenal. Do I see him as an immediate transfer? No, because I can also suggest that if you want to be invested into an Arsenal player, you probably want them for these games. You probably want someone who's a little bit more productive than him, just in terms of underlyings. Nonori hasn't played enough minutes to really say that his underlyings are representative of him as a player, and he's clearly a high-quality finisher. I think that's, without a doubt, something that I can already see with just watching him play very briefly this season, and as a Football Manager player as well. I always knew he was a highly rated player, so it's nice to see him live up to those sorts of expectations and score that wonderful goal as well versus City. But yeah, I'd say approach with a little bit of caution. Outside of that, I'd say I'd drop Ahmad and I'd drop Sar once again. These are both players that dropped just based on fixtures. Ahmad is now sort of dealing with more competition. And I think one of the things that unfortunately Ahmad suffers from is just how poor City really are as a team, and that's just been incredibly shocking. So with Ahmad, what I would also mention that is unfortunate with him is simply that he's been a player who can be played in the right wing back position at times, at the right attacking mid position. Even though he's gotten more of the minutes at the right attacking mid position so far, the baselines for City or United rather, are absolutely nowhere, and they are a team that I'm very worried about, because even as someone who's, let's say, a Bruno owner, I'm not expecting much from them as a team. And that's quite a shock, to be honest, considering that they've had amazing fixtures. And, you look ahead towards owning some of the attackers in their teams, considering the price points outside of Bruno. And we just haven't really been able to enjoy that much. He himself is a great player. When you compare the underlyings, I don't think he's necessarily much worse than any of the players here, to be honest. It's just that someone like Rodgers, in the immediate term, for example, still has a double. Some of the Bournemouth mids are just inherently better. And I think that's really what it comes down to. As far as the other players, in terms of the orange, Sar gets a drop, as I mentioned, because I do think that his minutes have also started to decline, although we know that they can also tick up with Eze potentially being more injured than we think, depending on what the outcome is and what Glasner tells us. Glasner hasn't been super forthrightful, or Eze and his own fitness is sort of being managed by himself as well, and sort of what he's allowed himself to be able to do on the pitch based on his pain tolerance, as I think I understand. So that can change things, but we're starting to see a little bit more rotation from the team, and you can see that the importance of Sar is being reflected, right? Mateta and Eze should be getting most minutes. as soon as possible, and then Sarr is still less important. And one of the things that I'd mention is that there's always going to be a bit of a niche here where anyone who's actually involved in set pieces is going to overperform, I would say, some of those underlying stats, because you're just looking at some of those open player numbers as well. And I think in terms of bonus creation, gathering as well, other things are more important. In the next tier, we have Trossard, and this is going back to the point on Ranieri. I think he's, of course, someone that you can say has quite a good history in terms of production. We have a lot of faith in terms of the production as well. There's going to be a segment on Havertz, and I'll talk about Havertz in a moment. I'm not sure whether he's actually fully injured. I've heard reports that he's injured. I don't know the extent of the injury right now whilst I'm recording this video, but I think Trossard should be a very good pick for the foreseeable. I mean, I can just see much more minutes for him, and he just should be a stellar pick, because in open play, you can get a lot of value from him if you're, let's say, invested into someone like Odegaard. I think the flip side always is that Ranieri can take corners, and if you have, let's say, Saka looming, for example, the value of Odegaard is just going to drop, right? And so the horizon of, let's say, owning Trossard might actually look better now than, let's say, the horizon of owning Odegaard. As he gets a drop, mostly due to these sort of injury-related conflicts. With Sobo, he gets a drop because you're coming out of some worse fixtures. Probably not fair for me to drop Sobo ahead of a double. I think he's an amazing hold for the double, but it's just a reflection of where he is in terms of the wider game state, and just overall in terms of the overall minutes that he gets compared to some of his peers in this category. So both Eze and Sobo drop for that sort of reason. Coming out of Gaming25, you're probably not wanting to own someone like Sobo, and that's that. As far as, let's say, the next tier, you've got Gordon with a drop as well. City away is actually a really good game. Let's not kid ourselves here. Maybe there were some additional City injuries as well. I was just watching the City versus Real Madrid game on my way home, and unfortunately, well, fortunately at least we won. But unfortunately, I had to kind of watch it whilst commuting home late, as the working hours are still pretty bad. But I enjoyed that win, and I enjoyed Man City collapsing. But you have to say, I think, when you have, let's say, a Kanji, Ake, Diaz, these are the sorts of players who are very injury prone. Stones as well, or at least have shown to be injury prone very recently. My concern with City is that it can all fall apart very, very quickly. And you can see that with the Real Madrid game as well. You know, as soon as you start to have to make concessions like playing Rico or even Kovacic at times, City becomes so much easier to play versus. And that's just a reflection of that. But Gordon, in terms of the wider landscape, right, City tangent aside, just has worse fixtures. He also has an impending blank in Gaming29. And there's just not too much value there really being instilled in Gordon. But still a very good player, still very good in open play, still very important for Newcastle, and I'm sure we'll have his importance rise again in the past. With Luis Diaz, the reason why I actually haven't dropped him in the same way with Sobo is because I still think he could be a decent own, because the minutes have actually been very, very consistent. Maybe it's wrong for me to sort of have Luis Diaz still a bit higher. I think you definitely keep him once again for the double, and then you can actually sell him anyways from 26. But it's more about generally the overall consistency, I would say, of expecting returns from Luis Diaz as well. Part of the value to Sobo, I suppose, is some of those sort of late runs. At the same time, when we're talking about, let's say, corners, he's on them whilst Trent is out, so he gets a little bit more set piece action whilst Trent is out, and he's going to benefit in the interim. But with Luis Diaz, I think I still always like someone who's going to play within the center forward position. With Jota playing more minutes, though, and Darwin playing reasonably well, you can argue that Luis Diaz is probably an orange, and maybe that's just an error on my part. In terms of Odegaard and Bruno, what I would actually say about these two players is I think a lot of people can see a lack of appeal from these players, and I completely understand. Some people will probably take issue with, you know, why they're not orange on the cheat sheet, and I think that's fair. But I still think at the end of the day, you have access to set pieces. These are still players who are still involved at times in open play with good actions. Like there are some games where, yes, Bruno, of course, is literally not even allowed to play or get inside the box. And I can't really understand or comprehend why you'd want to do that as a manager, but look, that's being done. With Odegaard, we can probably mention that, yes, the player of 2 years ago is not the one that we see in front of us. And that's been well reflected. He just scored a goal versus Man City, but at the same time, it was also just Man City. And it's hard to sort of gauge these players. But penalties, I think, is very important. And we always, I think, fail to sort of grasp how important it is at times. And then the bonus creation piece as well, which is quite significant in my opinion. So I would still keep these players as yellow just because the interim fixtures are actually quite good. And then also the impact in terms of not blanking Gaming29 is quite significant. With Odegaard, his curve is much shorter because he's eventually going to lose penalties back to hopefully a returning Bukayo Saka. And then in terms of Bruno, it really just depends on position. What we initially said a few weeks ago was if he plays minutes between the 6 and the 8, that's okay, or rather the 8 and the 10. Now it's actually looking worse, and it's almost what I said just now, like 6 and the 8, right? I'm not enjoying at all Bruno in open play. I can still see the markets are actually rating him quite highly in terms of how models are doing as well, which is quite surprising, but they are markets at the end of the day, and they can be wrong. What I would also mention about Bruno is I can still imagine that things can change in terms of how we would expect to evaluate some of these players going forwards, right? So in terms of, let's say, Bruno, who knows if there's going to be future tactical changes that can help enhance him, because there's still going to be, I think, times in the game where Bruno is going to be allowed to sort of roam and foray into the box, and his minutes will become very important in that context. And we're still seeing that the production, for the most part, in terms of the creation, is still there for the most part. And then in terms of Foden and Son, I think Foden just simply has bad fixtures. He's clearly been quite fixture proof in the past. This season has been up and down, in the sense that it was completely down until he hit a good run of form when he was playing some very, very easy oppositions, and City were able to claw back some points, and Foden was able to be chiefly quite important in those games. I still think that he is not someone that is a favorable own, but if you own him, why not keep him if you think that he can sort of maintain this level of form? And ultimately, a lot of the other City players just aren't playing well enough to actually deserve minutes within the attack, and he is, and so that's a benefit, I think, if you've somehow held Foden. And another point to mention is that the midfielders are actually so good within the other cheaper positions that it's not like suddenly that Mbumo's so much better than an Odegaard or a Bruno or a Foden. It's they're probably actually worth the same. So if money doesn't matter to you, then I think what is happening with the state of the game right now in terms of pricing is, if you own a couple Bournemouth midfielders, that's amazing, and you can therefore afford anyone between, let's say, Mbumo and Foden, or even Son, and it doesn't actually matter who you own. So because of that, I think I haven't been super harsh on some of these more expensive players, and that's just a symptom of how, I guess, broken or lopsided the Bournemouth midfielders are making team structures right now. As far as Son, this is the same thing. I think you can argue when you're watching Son play that it's very hard to watch, that he looks like he's a step behind, but he's still a penalty taker. He still plays an absurd amount of minutes because of the injuries that the team has faced, and how many minutes he's forced to play. Like, even within the FA Cup, for example, when they were about to be knocked out, he was playing a lot of minutes, and he's still ultimately getting into some really good positions. And so I kind of have to keep Son where he is because the fixtures are still quite good. As far as, let's say, Palmer and Salah, nothing to change there. Palmer is playing for a team in Chelsea where I think, yes, it's very concerning how they're playing, but you have to still look at the underlying stats and still say that Palmer is still extremely high producing as a player on the non-penalty stats. And whilst we've seen a little bit of a downtick there, it doesn't reflect him being a sell at all, and I think he's still one of the best players in the game by far. As far as the forwards, moving on to that, João Pedro gets a drop. I'm generally concerned about his position in the team. I'm sure some other Brighton experts might disagree with me and maybe just see that as natural rotation, but Rutter playing well within the 10 position in the FA Cup, I think, is significant. The 45-minute substitution might not have been so significant versus Nottingham Forest, because I think we even saw Mitoma being subbed, and he's arguably the most important player in the team right now in terms of being able to say, or to identify, let's say, an attacker who has nailed consistent minutes within the team. I think it might be a little bit too harsh of a reaction to João Pedro, but for those sort of underlying numbers, if you're not even playing consistent minutes, even though you're on penalties, I'm just going to have to dock him down. In the next tier, I have Cunha added, but the fixtures are still really bad up until game week 27, so we can reconsider him up until then. It's just about keeping a little bit of thought in your mind of planning ahead, and the idea that Cunha is actually going to be someone who's going to be very interesting for us game week 27 onwards. As far as the tier after that, I've actually added Havertz provisionally, but then there's also an asterisk around Havertz because there's a potential injury around Havertz that I've seen reported in terms of training in Dubai with Arsenal. I don't know the extent of the injury. It could be an extremely short-term injury, and we could see Havertz coming back soon. So we'll have to see what happens there. Obviously, if he's injured, don't buy him. But this is a really good run of games for Havertz, and I really do think for the people who are not planning a free at 29, which I think is actually a very plausible strategy, you might have to sell Isak if you're on a little bit of a cheaper team structure, and actually moving towards someone like Havertz does make sense provisionally. I did drop Mateta last week, which I felt bad in terms of, unfortunately dropping him, and then he gets a brace versus United, so I can hold my hands up there. It was a pretty bad move. United have been overall quite shocking as a team, but I don't think necessarily awful on defense. But there you have it. They absolutely let Mateta have some great chances, and he's proven to be a very solid, consistent pick within the game. He does blank in game 29, but you still have good fixtures in the distance, like Ipswich at home. If you're a Mateta owner, it's still a very easy situation where you own. If you're not a Mateta owner, it's still a tough situation where I think, is there really a reason to stretch towards him right now? Probably not. And it's a similar camp to how I also appreciate Wood, where I think if you own Wood, you hold. If you don't own Wood, I still wouldn't really buy into these games, and I'll happily say that looking at his underlying stats, even though he's performing like basically the best striker in the league in terms of finishing, or even just attacker in general. With Watkins, because of the double, he's one of those transfers where I would definitely classify him as a luxury transfer. This is not like investing into a player who is going to give you crazy dividends, because part of the double is Liverpool. The games coming out of double aren't great. He also blanks in game 29. So there's big asterisks around moving into a player like Watkins. But clearly, if you actually are really well endowed with free transfers, then this is a very easy consideration for you. And potentially, if you're willing to part ways with someone like Watkins, it could be the kind of side grade move that you can afford. Once again, if you're in a luxury position of having these banked free transfers. Moving on to defense now, we have Disasi being added as an option. I've removed Konsa because it seems like provisionally he will not play versus Ipswich, which is all the value towards an Aston Villa defender for the foreseeable future. Disasi will miss the game versus Chelsea, so that will be a blank fixture, and he will obviously miss game week 29 as well. But crucially, this is still an Ipswich game. He is still someone that is an entry point at 4.2 that can be really nice in terms of being a make weight for a lot of people. And even in my case, for example, could be a make weight to allow me to get an assistant manager, things like that. So I would take that into consideration. The whole and sole purpose of owning Disasi is really for game week 25. If you actually need a defender that needs to play more fixtures than that, then look away. And look away into someone like Howson or even Kirkett. So that's why Howson also gets a rise. In terms of all the other players here, you can't see too many changes, because I still think that a lot of the teams have mixed runs of games. So it's once again always about rotation with these sort of budget players between the 4.x price point. And then when you head towards the 5.x price point, you're kind of looking at players where you want to consistently start them most games. And that's how I'm kind of valuing them in terms of price point, and not judging singular fixtures for these 4.x's, but actually just thinking about how strong they are overall in terms of generally over, let's say, 6 to 8 games, how good they are and how good they can be. In terms of, let's say, the next tier, in the 4.5 plus tier, we have Bradley being added as an option, but I think this is a huge asterisk because, of course, it's just purely dependent on any kind of outcome of, let's say, Trent. We know that Trent has been involved in training so far, so maybe Bradley is not a pick to consider, but this is just the idea that if, let's say, we put this asterisk on Bradley, the idea that if Trent has a setback in training, anything like that, then Bradley becomes, of course, immediately an option to consider. But I think for now, just not someone that I would touch. Dean as well, same camp there, where I think you're spending a little bit too much for the player. You can still see a bit of rotation. They are fortunately excluded, I think, from playing Champions League fixtures for the next 2 weeks. And that's a big benefit because it just allows Dean to play more minutes. And more crucially, I think Dean gets to play this game week 25 double. If you own him, of course, he's an amazing pick for the double. And I think he's a very lucrative own. But transferring into Dean, I think, is not so advised because the fixtures around that aren't great. And he's going to be a transfer out. And then you spend more money on that sort of player. Whereas with Disasi, I mean, arguably he could be your 5th defender, and it's a little bit of a different situation. In the next tier, we have just more rating, I think, of Arsenal and their better fixture run. So Timber, Gabriel, Saliba all rise within this cheat sheet. I think Timber's minutes are still going to be really, really good. We do know that Ben White is training with the team, but I haven't really seen news in terms of when he's provisionally going to come back and start playing. We also know that Timber has been able to play previously on the left back position. I still think that Miles Skelly has played so well that I find it a little bit unlikely for Timber to get minutes there. I'm not willing to talk about Timber in the midfield, but for now, I think within the interim, you can still secure a lot of games, and within the anticipation that someone like Ben White comes back in March, and actually you can still enjoy Timber for the short term. Other than that, I've given Trent a drop, but it really is conditional on news like, what is the outcome of the Everton match? Does he play any minutes there? Do we see him even within the squad within the Everton game? What are Slot's continued comments on Trent and his recovery process? Because that has a huge impact on how I would evaluate Trent for now. And it's really hard to sort of put my finger on it. If he is even starting at Everton, you already know he's a green pick. If he's not, then I think he's just an easy hold for most managers. And I still don't think that, unless you're absolutely certain he won't feature versus Wolves, then I still think the idea that Trent is a hold is okay. Because if you think that he still starts maybe even the Villa game, your team structure might still rely around keeping Trent. But at the same time, if you're someone who's not going to free at 29, if you don't think that Trent will play versus Wolves, I also think it's very justifiable to sell. Create a team structure without Trent for now, and then revisit him when you wildcard. As far as the goalkeepers, move on to that. The only soft changes are giving Kepa a rise, reintroducing Martinez to the cheat sheet, and giving Pickford a drop coming out of the double. This is really mostly impacted by the fixtures, so nothing significant there. Bournemouth clearly embarking on a great run of fixtures, and that's just been a key theme within this series. The midfielders have always sort of been held to high regard, but now you've actually got really good fixtures for defense as well, which I really like. And then in terms of the assistant manager piece of it all, I've clearly worked around the assistant manager piece. Last week's assistant manager piece was predicated on there not being a surprise Liverpool versus Aston Villa double that was provisionally put in by the Premier League 2 days before the deadline, but they did do that, and fair play to them. I have to say that I completely did not anticipate that at all, so that's my bad potentially. I've been trying to follow fixture gurus, and I don't think this was really seriously discussed as a probability at all. We thought about Fulham versus Tottenham and the probability of that provisionally on Double GW25, but I didn't think that we could have had Liverpool versus Aston Villa, but we've arrived at the point where we do. So now Emery joins the cheat sheet. He's clearly a top option for GW25. He's okay for GW26. And on GW27, I mean, you're probably not going to be considering Emery at all. As far as, let's say, someone like Silva, really good GW25, but just not really a consistent option after that. As far as, let's say, Ursula, decent for 25 and 26, and then really, really good for 27. The reason why I mention this is because actually on 27, there are a couple managers that are very, very good. And this is also because some people are still on, let's say, an AM24 strategy, and some people are still on an AM25 strategy. So the way that I would work around this is I have, for the most part, said that I think if you're jumping from, let's say, a green to orange manager 1 week after the next, and you're on an AM curve, I think it's okay to stay on that sort of manager. But if you can somehow move from a green to a green, and you actually have the free transfers allowing you to do so without taking a hit, I would always take the opportunity to move from a green to a green. And that's kind of the guiding point of this cheat sheet here with the assistant manager chip. I would say Pereira and Maresca are all great options as well in Game 27. Depending, of course, on finalized table bonus, which will be the outcome, of course, on 25 and 26. I will not be updating the AM cheat sheet in terms of fixtures like Game 28 or 29, because I still think that it's not really worth considering outside of at least being able to secure a double within the AM curve. So I might update, let's say, where I rank the managers in 26 and 27, but I'm not going to provisionally update for future game weeks up until the next set of doubles. So probably the next time you'll see the assistant manager sort of 3-week chart will be in Game Week 31. And that's just a reflection of the kind of landscape in terms of how to fit in with your regular chip strategy. So for people who are on assistant manager 24, clearly you're already on slot and therefore you don't have any considerations to make. You might not even have a transfer to make on 26. If you're on Moyes, he's been taken out of the cheat sheet because the idea is I really do think that he's worth the transfer towards, let's say, an Emery or a Silva this week if you want to make that move. Silva is your classic case of table bonus. I think it's a really good chance to actually take a team that is playing at home versus a team that gives them table bonus. With Emery, it's the exact opposite of that. It's basically a repeat of Moyes and hopefully a better chance of getting a result versus Liverpool, which is, once again, I have to express, very unlikely still because of how good Liverpool have been over the course of the season. As far as Ursula, just good at 27. Arteta, we mentioned, was a great transfer to move into on 26. The same with Van Nistelrooy if you want a chance table bonus there. Outside of that, I would say most of the other managers aren't very seriously considered or worth considering up until 27, as I mentioned. So that's kind of the general strategy piece on assistant manager. Some people will be embarking on assistant manager 25. If you are already tripled up on Liverpool, I think the launch pad is still going to be Emery and then moving your free transfers ahead of that, because we know that 26 and 27 aren't amazing for Aston Villa if you consider those two in isolation. Therefore, it's already worth a free transfer on 26 if you can. The only thing I'd say is if you are looking to, let's say, jump off of Emery into a manager that has pretty good fixtures on 26 and 27, then actually Emery to Ursula, I guess, is not bad if you only want to extend one free transfer. If you want to use both free transfers, I think, club hopping from basically Silva to Van Nistelrooy to another manager is totally fine and totally acceptable. So those are my thoughts in terms of the assistant managership. Thank you guys so much for watching the whole video in terms of the GW25 cheat sheet. I hope this has been illustrative. Once again, I'm still working really late nights and I plan to respond to all the comments on Friday, or rather Thursday night ahead of the deadline. might not be able to do a live stream on Friday. I'll try my best to do so, but otherwise, take care, goodbye, and I'll see you guys soon.